Hi, welcome to History Respawned. I'm your host, Bob Whitaker. On this episode, I'm sharing a selection from a recent episode of the History Respawn podcast for our subscribers on YouTube. The History Respawn podcast is available wherever you get podcasts, and it features a wider array of content than what you'll find on the YouTube feed. So if you enjoy watching History Respawn, consider subscribing to the podcast as well. This excerpt from the podcast comes from a recent episode on Hearts of Iron 4, and features John and I talking about the game's counterfactual scenarios from the Man the Guns DLC. I hope you enjoy.
Yeah. So I wanted to talk a brief moment about some of the controversial elements within Man the Guns, and in particular has to do with the DLC's focus on a new alternative history path for the United States. And in particular, as America in the DLC Man the Guns, you can set the country up through the national focus system to basically have another civil war that could result in the reestablishment of the Confederacy. And essentially, this course of action begins by having Franklin Delano Roosevelt, FDR, lose either the 1936 or the 1940 presidential election, depending on when you start the game.
Right.
And then diverting America's national focus to a particular branch of the national focus tree. And these things on this side of the branch include things like reestablishing the gold standard, extending the Chinese Exclusion Act, deregulating the banking sector, from the New Deal. And then finally, the kind of one of the culminating moments is you can improve diplomatic relations with Germany through the personage of Charles Lindbergh.
Right.
The famous American aviator was also perhaps the most famous Hitler apologist or Nazi apologist in America during the 1930s, early 1940s. And the thing is that, Paradox has, in many ways, made their games with alternate history storylines in mind, right? I mean, that's kind of the main strength of what you can do in Europa Universalis or in Crusader Kings. You can live out alternate histories, and they've definitely done it too with Hearts of Iron. The previous Hearts of Iron games have done this. Wake the Tiger has got Depose Hitler or Restoring Democracy in Japan. And the thing is that for the most part, I don't have a problem with those alternative storylines, but I do have a bit of a problem with this alternative storyline, particularly given the fact that it comes in the midst of, kind of ongoing fascination with white supremacy and the Confederacy in general in America. And then also the fact that, as is very well known and very well publicized by a lot of different sites, including Kotaku and Rock, Paper, Shotgun, Paradox games are really attractive to right-wing player forums. Particularly on 4chan, who like to use their games as the basis for exploring, ethno-nationalist mythical histories, essentially.
Right.
And so it's a weird decision on their part to take this alternative history, which is, I think, one that is very popular to that subset of players, and basically, I feel like it gives a stamp of approval to it. By giving the players the tools to explore this alternative history, they're essentially saying, that this type of play, this type of exploration of the past is okay. Now, I would say, to Paradox's defense, because the way the national focus system works, you have to self-select as the player to follow this course of history, right? So there's not a way that you can start as the Confederacy at the beginning of Hearts of Iron 4. You've got to start as America with FDR as president, and then you have got to go through and self-select the national focus that leads you towards reestablishing the Confederacy. So, in other words, the problems I have with this is somewhat mitigated by the fact that the player has to make the decision, right? Paradox doesn't offer it up to them already, but still, that I don't know if that does enough to to mitigate all the problems that I have with this. I mean, to begin with, the very idea of having the Confederacy come back into an existence in the late 1930s it's so ridiculous it almost borders on science fiction, right? You know, if you were to begin the game in 1936 or 39, depending on when you start, the Confederacy's been destroyed for over 70 years, right? So much time has passed that many of the historical realities from the mid 19th century can't be counted upon to re-emerge in the 1930s, right? And also, you're kind of papering over the huge differences within the South over their opinion, ranging from things on the New Deal or even war against Germany, right? You know, many states within the South were actually in favor of fighting the Nazis. And then, you know, with the Confederacy storyline in the game, you know, historians, you know, they often look at counterfactual scenarios. You know, they do it a lot to kind of question established historiography on certain topics. But the ways in which they traditionally look at counterfactual scenarios tends to be really limited, right? It's usually like they're looking at one particular event, they're working at one particular decision that was made, and then seeing, well, maybe what would have happened if that hadn't been made. What this counterfactual scenario is doing is it's essentially taking an amazingly ahistorical idea, right? The Confederacy coming back to life after 70 years and bringing it into the 1930s, 1940s. And that, for me, that goes a little bit too far. You can't simply hand wave this and say, well, this is similar to saying a counterfactual scenario in which Hitler is assassinated, or that this is similar to a scenario in which the British fascists are really strong and take over Britain. Those are somewhat realistic, somewhat authentic, to use your word, somewhat authentic counterfactuals that you could explore. But putting the Confederacy in this context, in this scenario, it seems to me to be wantingly provocative and objectionable.
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to play devil's advocate a little bit because I feel honestly, I feel very similarly to you.
I'm getting off my soapbox right now.
No, but I think that I think what interests me is the horrors of the factual in some sense, right? And this is obviously a game. I mean, so you can control the Nazis, like and the game. It's funny because the way the game works, you can change government types, and it's not an easy thing to do. But you can go in, you can take over Germany, and you can make Germany a broadly democratic, power-hungry state by 1938 or so, with a bit of effort. If you want. The Japanese, of course, committed terrible war crimes. Chairman Mao, who in Waking the Tiger is holed up in Yan'an in the northwest, was personally responsible for the deaths of tens of millions of people in peacetime, right? So I suppose one could argue then that this is allowing you a chance. Like, this is a path. There were people in the United States, and not just a small number of kooks, thankfully a minority of people, but a sizable minority who were okay with things like this, like the Chinese Exclusion Act and everything else.
Sure.
So why not explore that? But the one thing I'll say as well before that I kind of put that up as a potential mitigating factor. But I will say what's interesting is I've played a US playthrough before Man the Guns came out, where I basically turned the US communist. Which took a lot of effort and was an absolute ball. And communism, you know, Stalin and Mao and all that stuff, it felt transgressive, but it didn't feel gross. Maybe because I'm a European and I'm socialist at heart, I don't know, right? But it didn't feel gross.
You disgust me, by the way.
but the Confederacy does feel gross. So I guess I'm asking you kind of a deliberately awkward question, difficult question, or silly question, really. What if, instead of reviving the Confederacy, which, as you say, feels like a leap in a way that other counterfactuals in the game don't actually necessarily feel like that much of a leap?
Yes.
Like, it's not a huge leap it's a big leap. The Japanese and the Americans would have decided to be allies, but it's not an insane idea. But what if, instead of the Confederacy coming back, there was a chance to be a kind of an ethno-nationalist, as it were, and bring the US down that path? I mean, the Irish government, for example, our Senate and stuff was influenced by Mussolini, you know, like the corporate structure of government and everything else. And in the 1920s, before fascism became identified with, you know, the attempts to wipe out entire peoples, whether it be Jewish people, disabled people, homosexual people, everything else. People were talking about this like there's some good ideas here.
Yeah.
So would that be? Would an ethno-nationalist, fascist or quasi-fascist U.S. would that be just as bad? Like, do you know what I mean? Like, how much is tied into? I think you're making a really interesting point because it's not just the Confederacy is bad, although it was. I was really interested in how you couch that. Yeah, but it actually makes no sense historically.
Yeah.
So would something that would kind of be odious in concept if it had happened be less frustrating to play or give you less of these issues if it was not as out there as the Confederacy idea feels?
Absolutely. I think you're totally right. I mean, for instance, let's take the figure of Charles Lindbergh, right? What if we created an ethno-nationalist state based around Charles Lindbergh?
Right.
Now, of course, that would be a disaster. He was a terrible speech maker and politician, et cetera. But it would feel more authentic to that time period than taking the Confederacy, the iconography of the Confederacy,
right,
and bringing it almost wholesale, including the color palettes for the Confederacy is in the game, right? Bringing that wholesale 70 years into the future, right? That feels like it feels like sci-fi, right? And it feels like sci-fi in a really distressing and disturbing way, in the sense that, it is playing into this kind of ethno-nationalist history that you get from right-wing provocateurs online. That the game, in a sense, has taken the elements of that provocation, particularly the color palette, the flags, the kind of phraseology of the Confederacy, and brought that forward into a counterfactual scenario, which is in a game, but it's still kind of giving license to those ethno-nationalist ideologies in the present day, right? Saying we should bring back the Confederacy, that we should have the Confederate battle flag waving at public events or in public venues or at state legislatures, et cetera, or even at in Washington, D.C. So I think that's my problem. Is it's the Confederacy, whatever you want to call it, the kind of Confederacy visual aspects, the kind of the phraseology of the Confederacy that's brought forward, instead of creating a completely counterfactual but a little bit more believable ethno-nationalist state within the 1930s, 1940s context.
Yeah, I think that I have a question for you. I think I'd probably know the answer to this, but I haven't played any of the Confederate stuff or seen it really. I'm assuming the way the national focus works, I guess it's not possible to be like a reformed Confederacy. Do you know what I mean? Like, I'm assuming the decisions. Yeah. So so racism, et cetera, like it's baked into what the Confederate state is going to be. Okay.
Yes. And the thing is that when you start going down the Confederacy path, you do several things at once that kind of really set the stage for it, right? So instead of just starting with reestablishing the Confederacy, having a civil war, you do things like extend the Chinese Exclusion Act. You do things like establish HUAC, the House Un-American Activities Committee. So it makes it very clear from the outset as to where you are going with this, right? And those are very early national focuses, right? So for people who haven't played before, you select national focuses, and they're kind of like research selections. So you select one, it takes like, 6-7 months, and then you select another. So you're going down a branch of a particular set of national focuses that ends in the Confederacy. It doesn't start with the Confederacy, it ends with the Confederacy. It ends with the establishment of this white ethno-nationalist state. And so the parts that go into that process make it very clear that you are self-selecting a system that is going to attack minorities, it's going to persecute communists, and presumably also going to restrict the rights of women.
To hear the rest of this discussion, please subscribe to the History Respawn podcast, available from Apple, SoundCloud, Stitcher, Podbean, Luminary, and wherever you get your podcasts. Until next time, goodbye.